There's a famous quote. It's always attributed to Joseph Stalin, but he wasn't that smart. It's actually a German journalist, Kurt Tucholsky, but it doesn't matter. The death of one man is a tragedy. The death of a million men is a statistic. And nothing represents that better than the Great Depression. And the reason I say nothing represents it better than the Great Depression is when it comes to war, people can have a basic understanding of what a lot of deaths mean. But when it comes to the tragedy of an economic collapse, people have very strong opinions without understanding the full toll, real human toll of the Great Depression. Because it really was catastrophic. Within 6 weeks of the stock market collapse, about 100,000 Americans were losing their jobs every day. The sheer scale of unemployment during the Depression is just mind-boggling. By 1932, 1933, it was almost 13 million Americans that were fully unemployed. The exact number is like 12,000 or 12.8 million. It's hard to imagine that many people. That is about, it got to be about 25% of the US population that were desperate for a job. Let me give you an idea of the numbers we're talking about. Take Cowboy Stadium. It fits 80,000 people. And fill it up to the absolute brim. Every seat's taken. You go in there and you sell all 80,000 of them. You're all fired. And none of you will have a job for at least 4 years. None of you will have full-time employment for at least 4 years. And then you do that. And then you do that more than 160 days in a row. Fill it up with 80,000 people, and fire them all. They're all unemployed for more than 4 years. And that is the scale of unemployment we are talking about here. In huge cities where there was a lot of industry, the numbers were in the 50 to 80% range. So it was even higher in certain places. And these were people that wanted jobs. They desperately wanted to work. All those pictures show you, people just sat in line desperately fighting for jobs. The level of hunger was amazing. People just stood in line all days just for loaves of bread. Even people that were able to keep their jobs, their pay was cut and their hours were cut. 75% of all employed people were working part-time, and not because they wanted to, because they had to. So a vast majority of the U.S. population was underemployed and underutilized. That means, obviously, they would rather work, but a lot of people just spent their days standing in line waiting to get food. Al Capone opened up a soup kitchen. Times Square, people in line just to get a meal. And these lines were just enormous. Personal income in the United States between 1929 and 1933, when FDR came into office, more than halved. So basically half of all personal income just vanished. People ate whatever they possibly could get their hands on. You still hear people say that no one starved to death in the Great Depression. That is just factually incorrect. And I know a lot of people that say that. You have to be willingly ignorant in terms of not actually reading firsthand accounts and what life was like. And I mean, government documents, government reports. In 1932 alone in New York, we knew there was at least 20,000 malnourished children, and we know of at least 24 cases of starvation, dying because they didn't have food. And that is just in New York, and we know absolutely for sure it's because we don't have all of the accounts. There is just so many people that could not get food. And there's so many tragic stories about it too. There's a case in Houston, Texas in 1931. A father reported that one of his daughters, he had twin daughters, one of them died. One of them was murdered, and they found her body. She was 9 years old in a river. Turns out the dad had done it himself. He had taken out a life insurance policy on her, and he said it was either one die or we're all going to die, because he had a family of like 5. I mean, the level of tragedy of the Great Depression is unimaginable. Homelessness became rampant. People just couldn't pay their mortgages. They were forced out of their homes. Throughout 1933 alone, there were more than 1,000 foreclosures every day. At the height of the Depression, more than 1.2 million Americans were homeless. It's Hooverville. Hooverville's popped up all over the country, and people lived in just absolute shacks. A lot of people, when they lost their homes, they would just pack everything up and just start driving. They had no idea where they were going. And if you're wondering, how do we know all this? We'll get to this. During the New Deal, there will be a government program where federal government pays unemployed photographers to go out and capture pictures of what the Depression was like. So that's how we have a very well-documented account of what it was like. This woman, she and her husband were driving with all their stuff they owned in their car, and one of their tires went flat. Oh no, I'm sorry. They ran out of gas. The husband just took the gas can and left. He has no money. Before there were cell phones, he just took his gas can and said, "I'll be back." She's there with their 1-year-old child, and there's nothing they can do. Just wait. People that did have homes, they would just rent out rooms to anyone that could possibly pay. There's 7 people staying in a room. Sometimes if people that had houses, they would charge like 1 cent a night, whatever they could possibly get, and house as many people as they possibly could. State of children is just horrifying. They all over the country. And this is during the New Deal. This is after the federal government got involved. They would set up these camps where they would allow homeless people to stay for a few days. This woman here is 19 years old. Baby is eating dirt. The number of kids that became vagabonds and just were roaming the country, we never will know for sure, but it was somewhere between 200 and 250,000 kids. There were kids just riding the rails, just hopping on trains and going wherever they could. What feral cats do whenever they have too many kittens, the mother will take the youngest child or the youngest kitten and just set it somewhere and just leave it. That's how they are able to feed the other ones. So it's like, get rid of one so the other ones can survive. It's how I got my cat, Catty. the state of children was just horrific. That woman there's 18 years old. Her husband died. She's at one of those government created camps where people just went. She has two kids. She has no education, no background, no experience in anything. I mean, what chance does she have? Children living on the outskirts of Washington, D.C. It's amazing, though, how adaptable kids are. Even throughout the Depression, though, as late as 1937, some like 20% of American children did not have one full set of clothing. That is insane. Especially when you get to tenant farmers, a lot of them didn't have shoes. Eleanor Roosevelt, you can still read all of her mail that she received. She got a lot of mail from high schoolers saying, I want to go to college, or middle schoolers saying, I want to go to high school, but I don't have a pair of clothing. Can you please send me any clothing you have so I can make something? 1930, in 1930 alone, school enrollment dropped by some 3 million students. Kids just couldn't go to school, partly because schools couldn't afford to be open in a lot of places. State funding for states dried up, tax revenue dried up, so they just started closing schools. Other times, kids couldn't go to school because they didn't have a whole set of clothing, or some just couldn't afford to. Thousands of schools closed during the Depression, during the early years of the Depression at least. And for the very first time in U.S. history, 1932, 1933, college enrollment throughout the nation dropped by about 80,000 students. It is the first time in a time of peace when college enrollment dropped. Infant mortality went up 20% from 1929 to 1939. So, I mean, it was just absolutely catastrophic. For farmers, it was really bad. Farmers were already doing incredibly bad. They've been doing bad since the 1870s. And in the 1920s, they were doing bad, and their situation got even worse because the United States experienced the worst climatological disaster in its history up to that point. And this was man-made. The United States, the center of the United States, it was plains, so tall grasses. It was basically turned into a giant desert. They overused the land. They, planted and basically sucked all the nutrients out of it. So the center of the United States, essentially from Texas up to Canada, from Mississippi over to the Rockies, it became this giant desert, essentially. And that giant desert became a dust bowl. Huge storm clouds just covered the country. And these storm clouds were so big. You can see that picture in the bottom. That is a water tower. The tiny little thing's a water tower. People that lived through this, there is nothing you could do. With your house, you could put everything you possibly wanted over all the windows and doors. And once one of these dust storms came through, everything in your house is covered in dust. You can see the far end of that road, there's a car trying to drive away from, trying to escape that huge dust storm. Dust storms came through and just covered absolutely everything. Some of these dust storms were so big that they would actually reach Washington, D.C. There were times when Congress would be in session and the sky would just be copper because these dust storms were so massive. Forced 2.5 million people to abandon their homes and just pack up everything they have. I mean, even if you were part of the land that had not destroyed the soil. Like some farmers, they would rotate crops or do agricultural practices that would make the land maintain its nutrition. It didn't matter because these things were so big, it would just cover everything. That is a car that was just completely covered. You would have to dig out your entire fence line. People that had cattle, your entire cattle stock was absolutely destroyed. So 2.5 million Americans in that whole region just packed up their stuff and just left. They just packed up, and most of them went west. Most of them went out to California. There was a huge exodus of people from California. They just put everything they had in a wagon or whatever they had and just walked. That's what this is here. That is everything that family owns. And they have no idea what they're going to find out in California. They're just walking. So obviously, what happened in California was a disaster. Just this mass migration of people into California, which just completely upended the entire population. They called them all Okies. Not all of them were from Oklahoma, obviously, but they just got that nickname. The fun fact, you don't have to know this, but I talk about the water crisis that the United States, well, the whole world is going through, freshwater crisis. And it is, most recently, Mexico City is actually running out of water very fast. The United States, there's a lot of places that they're going to run out of water. And when they run out of water, pretty much everything, the 7 states connected to the Colorado River, we are going to see a mass migration. So if there is an area, when stuff like this happens, it will affect everyone all throughout Texas, because they're going to leave, when they leave Colorado River areas, they're definitely coming to Texas. The most famous of this group is a woman named Florence Owens Thompson. As I mentioned, during the New Deal, the federal government will actually pay people to go out and get the stories of these people that are struggling from the Great Depression. One of them, one of the most famous, her name was Dorothy Lang. She worked for what's called the Resettlement Administration, and she traveled throughout the country looking at these migrant camps where people stopped when they were just trying to figure out where they're going to go. And when Dorothy Lang was going to one of these that was in California, she stopped and she found a woman, Florence Owens Thompson. Thompson had, I think it was 5 kids. 2 of them went with the father. They were going to go find a tire for their car, I think it was. And Dorothy Lang asked, "Can I take your picture?" Florence said no. That's one of the most fascinating things about the Great Depression is so many people felt just ashamed of themselves. They blamed themselves for, their bank collapsed and they lost their life savings. They blamed themselves. There was a lot of them just were embarrassed. And so Florence said, "No, I don't, you're not going to take my picture," because she didn't want anyone to see her like that. Dorothy Lang said, "If you let me, it could help a lot of people." And so Florence said, "Fine, as long as you just send it to your bosses and you don't let anyone else see it." Florence, she took one of the most iconic pictures of the Great Depression, Migrant Mother. It's interesting, though. She doesn't look hopeless. She looks like she's trying to figure out what she's going to do next to keep her family alive. When Florence sent this, when Dorothy Lang sent these pictures back to Washington, D.C., they knew this was a powerful picture. And so this picture actually ended up being sent back out to newspapers, and it was published all throughout the country, all throughout the country, this picture ran on the front pages of a lot of newspapers, and it talked about the 25 to 3,500 migrants that were going through this same camp in migrant camp in California. In one sense, it was successful. The picture was so powerful. 20,000 pounds of food was sent to that camp. By the time the food got there, of course, Florence and her family had already moved on. It's kind of funny. The journalist found Florence some, I think it was like in the 60s, so some 30 years later after this, and Florence was still pissed off at Dorothy Lange that her face became the face of the Great Depression. And as you would expect, a lot of people just gave up. Depression has got me licked. There's no work to be had. I can't accept charity, and I'm too proud to appeal to my kin or friends, and I'm too honest to steal. So I see no other course. A land flowing with milk and honey, and a first-class mechanic can't make an honest living. I would rather take my chances with a just God than with an unjust humanity. Suicide rate went up by 40% between 1929 and 1933. 1933 is, to this day, has the highest rate or per capita suicides of any year in all of U.S. history. 2023, just random note, has the highest rate of suicides in terms of total number, over 50,000. Economic desperation it leads to so many heartbreaking stories that it is impossible. Quantifying it doesn't do it justice. It is just a tragedy, and the Great Depression is a tragedy that's unparalleled.